penguins are, of course, extremely interesting and classic animals all throughout entertainment, literature, society, science. So I'm happy to get stuck into such a fundamental and classic creature to our society. Of course, you will know that they are staples from zoos and zoological institutions, so this is going to be interesting. Now, if you have anything for me to read, please leave it in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I would be happy to read anything that you are interested in me reading about. Now, without any further ado, please remember I can't pronounce scientific terminology or names. And let's dive into this whispering Wikipedia. The penguin. Penguins are a group of aquatic flightless birds. They lived almost exclusively in the southern hemisphere, with only one species, the Galapagos penguin, found north of the equator. Highly adapted for life in the water, penguins have counter-shaded dark and white plumage and flippers for swimming. Most penguins feed on krill, fish, squid, and other forms of sea life, which they catch while swimming underwater. They spend roughly half of their lives on land, and the other half in the sea. Almost all penguin species are native to the southern hemisphere. They are not found only in cold climates such as Antarctica. In fact, only a few species of penguin live so far south. Several species are found in the temperate zone, but one species, the Galapagos penguin, lives near the equator. The largest living species is the emperor penguin, and on average adults are about 1.1, which is 3 feet 7 inches tall, and weigh about 35 pounds. The smallest penguin is the little blue penguin, also known as the fairy penguin, which stands at 33 centimeters, which is 13 inches tall, and weighs 1 kilogram, which is 2.2 pounds. Among extant penguins, larger penguins inhabit colder regions, while smaller penguins are generally found in temperate or even tropical climates, like you will find fairy penguins in Australia, my country. Some prehistoric species attained enormous sizes, becoming as tall or as heavy as an adult human. These were not restricted to Antarctic regions. On the contrary, sub-Antarctic regions harbored high diversity, and at least one giant penguin occurred in a region around 2,000 kilometers south of the equator, 35 million years ago, in a climate decidedly warmer than today. Now let's go to their etymology. The word penguin first appears in the 16th century as a synonym for great auk. When European explorers discovered what are today known as penguins in the southern hemisphere, they noticed their similar appearance to the great auk of the northern hemisphere and named them after this bird, although they are not closely related. The etymology of the word penguin is still debated. The English word is not apparently of French, Breton, or Spanish origin, the latter two attributed to the French word penguin, auk, but first appears in English or Dutch. Some dictionaries suggest a derivation from Welsh, pen, head, and gwyn, white, including the Oxford English Dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary, the Century Dictionary, and Merriam-Webster. On the basis of the name was originally applied to the great auk, either because it was found on the Whitehead Island in Newfoundland or because it had white circles around its eyes, though the head was black. Moving to Pinguinus. Since 1871, the Latin word Pinguinus has been used in scientific classification to the name the genus to the great auk, which became extinct in the mid-19th century. As confirmed by a 2004 genetic study, the genus Pinguinus belongs to the family of auks within the order of the Charadoriformes. The birds currently known as penguins were discovered later and were so named by sailors because of the physical resemblance to the great auk. Despite this resemblance, however, they are not auks, and they are not closely related to the great auk. They do not belong in the genus Pinguinus and are not classified in the same family and order as the great auk. They were classified in 1831 by Bonaparte in several distinct genera within the family Sphensphichidae and the order Sphensphixiformes. Now we look at systematics and evolution. The number of extant penguin species is debated. Depending on which authority is followed, penguin biodiversity varies between 17 and 20 living species, all in the subfamily Sphenicinae. Some sources consider the white flipped penguin a separate Eudiptula species, while others treat it as a subspecies of the little penguin. The actual situation seems to be more complicated. Similarly, it is unclear whether the royal penguin is merely a colourmorph of the macaroni penguin. The status of the rockhopper penguin is also unclear. And now, we move to taxonomy. Some recent sources apply the phylogenetic taxon Sphenicidae to what here is referred to as Sphenicinae. Furthermore, they restrict the phylogenetic taxon Pheniciformes to flightless taxa and establish the phylogenetic taxon Panspheniformes as equivalent to the linear taxon Spheniciformes, including any flying basal proto-penguins to be discovered eventually, given that neither the relationships of the penguin subfamilies to each other nor the placement of the penguins in the avian phylogeny is presently resolved. This is confusing, so the established Linnean system is followed here. Now, we go to evolution. The evolutionary history of penguins is well researched and represents a showcase of evolutionary biogeography. Although penguin bones of any one species vary much in size, a few good specimens are known. The alpha taxonomy of many prehistoric forms still leaves much to be desired. Some seminal articles about penguins of prehistory have been published since 2005. The evolution of the living genera can be considered resolved by now. The basal penguins lived around the time of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event somewhere in the general area of southern New Zealand and birdland Antarctica. Due to plate tectonics, these areas were at that time less than 1,500 kilometers, which is 930 miles, apart, rather than 4,000 kilometers, which is 2,500 miles of today. The most recent common ancestor of penguins and their sister clade can be roughly dated to the Cambrian-Maastrichtian boundary around 70 to 68 million years ago. What can be said as certainly as possible in the absence of direct, e.g. fossil, evidence is that by the end of the Cretaceous, the penguin lineage must have been evolutionarily well distinct, though much less so morphologically. It is fairly likely that they were not entirely yet flightless at that time, as flightless fossils. The oldest known fossil penguin is the species Waimanu manneringi, which lived in the early Paleocene epoch of New Zealand, or about 62 million years ago. While they were not as well adapted to aquatic life as modern penguins, Waimanu were generally loon-like birds, but already flightless with short wings adapted for deep diving. They swam on the surface using mainly their feet, but the winged were, as opposed to most other diving birds, both living and extinct, already adapting to underwater locomotion. Periptypes from northern Peru was dated to 42 MYA million years ago. An unnamed fossil from Argentina proves that by the Bartonian Middle Eocene, some 39 to 38 MYA primitive penguins had spread to the South America and were in the process of expanding into Atlantic waters. Now we move to Paleo-Euthypteans. During the late Eocene and the early Oligocene, 40 to 30 MYA, some lineages of gigantic penguins existed. Nordenskjold's giant penguin was the tallest, growing nearly 1.80 meters, which is 5'9" tall. The New Zealand giant penguin was probably the heaviest, weighing 80 kilograms or more. Both were found on New Zealand, the former also in the Antarctic farther eastwards. Traditionally, most extinct species of penguins, giant or small, had been placed in the paraphyletic subfamily called Paleoeuthyptae. More recently, with the new taxa being discovered and placed in the phylogeny if possible, it is becoming accepted that there were at least two major extinct lineages. One or two closely related ones occurred in Patagonia, and at least one other, which is or includes the Paleoeuthypteans as recognized today, occurred on most Antarctic and subantarctic coasts. But size, plasticity seems to have been great at this initial stage of penguin radiation. On Seymour Island, Antarctica, for example, around 10 known species of penguins ranging in size from medium to huge apparently coexisted. Some 35 MYA during the Priabonian late Eocene. It is not even known whether the gigantic Paleoeuthypteans constitute a monophyletic lineage or whether gigantism was evolved independently in a much restricted Paleoeuthypteanae and the Anthropornithinae, whether they were considered valid, or whether there was a wide size range present in the Paleoeuthypteanae as delimited as usually done these days, i.e. including the Anthropornis nordenskjoldsi. The oldest well-described giant penguin, the 5-foot, 1.5 meter tall Idactes salasi, actually occurred as far north as Peru, about 36 MYA. In any case, the gigantic penguins had disappeared by the end of the Paleogene around 25 MYA. Their decline and disappearance coincided with the spread of the Squaliodontidia and other primitive fish-eating toothed whales, which certainly competed with them for food and were ultimately more successful. A new lineage, the Paraptenodites, which included smaller but decidedly stout-legged forms, had already arisen in southernmost South America by that time. The early Neogene saw the emergence of yet another morphotype in the same area, the similarly sized but more gracile Paleosphenicinae, as well as the other radiation that gave rise to the penguin biodiversity of our time. Now we look to origin and systematics of modern penguins. Modern penguins constituted two undisputed clades and another two more basal genera with more ambiguous relations. To help resolve the evolution of this order, 19 high-coverage genomes that, together with two previously published genomes, encompass all extant penguin species that have been sequenced. The origin of the Spherecinae lies probably in the latest Paleogene, and geographically it must have been much the same as the general area in which the order evolved. The oceans between the Australia-New Zealand region and the Antarctic, presumably diverging from other penguins around 40 MYA. It seems that the Spherecinae were for quite some time limited to their ancestral area, as the well-researched deposits of the Antarctic Peninsula and Patagonia have not yielded Paleogene fossils of the subfamily. Also, the earliest Spherecine lineages are those with the most southern distribution. The genus Aptenodytes appears to be the basal most divergence among living penguins. They have bright yellow-orange neck, breast and bill patches, incubate by placing their eggs on their feet, and when they hatch the chicks are almost naked. This genus has a distribution centered on the Antarctic coasts and barely extends to some sub-Antarctic islands today. Now we move to Phygoceles, and it contains species with a fairly simple black and white head pattern. Their distribution is intermediate, centered on Antarctic coasts but extending somewhat northwards from there. In external morphology, these apparently still resemble the common ancestors of the Spherecinae, as Aptenodytes autapomorphes are in most cases fairly pronounced adaptations related to the genus' extreme habitat conditions. As the former genus Phygoceles seems to have diverged during the Bartonian, but the range, expansion and radiation that led to the present-day diversity probably did not occur during much later, around the Burdigalian stage of the early Miocene, roughly 20 to 15 MYA. The genera Spheniscus and Eutiptula contain species with mostly sub-Antarctic distribution centered on South America. Some, however, range quite far northwards. They all lack carotenoid coloration, and the former genus has a conspicuous banded head pattern. They are unique among living penguins by nesting in burrows. This group probably radiated eastwards with the Antarctic circumpolar current out of the ancestral range of modern penguins throughout the Chattian, the late Oligocene, starting approximately 28 MYA. While the two genera separated during this time, the present-day diversity is the result of the Pliocene radiation taking place some 4 to 2 MYA. The megatypes Eutyps clades occurs at similar latitudes, though not as far north as the Galapagos penguin, has its high diversity in the New Zealand region and represents a westward dispersal. They are characterized by hairy yellow ornamental head feathers. Their bills are at least partly red. These two genera diverged apparently in the middle Miocene. But again, the living species of Eutyptes are the product of a later radiation stretching from about the late Toarcian to the end of the Pliocene. Now we move to geography. The geographical and temporal pattern of the Sphenicene evolution corresponds closely to the two episodes of global cooling documented in the paleoclimatic record. The emergence of the circumpolar current also started as a continuous circumpolar flow only around 30 MYA, on the other hand forcing Antarctic cooling, and on the other facilitating the eastward expansion of the spheniscus to South America and eventually beyond. Despite this, there is no fossil evidence to support the idea of ground radiation from the Antarctic continent in the Paleogene, although DNA study favours such a radiation. Later, an interspersed period of slight warming was ended by the Middle Miocene climate transition, a sharp drop in the global average temperature from 14 to 12 MYA, and similar abrupt cooling events followed at 8 MYA and 4 MYA. By the end of the Tortonian, the Antarctic ice sheet was already much like today in volume and extent. The emergence of most of today's subantarctic penguin species almost certainly was caused by this sequence of neogene climate shifts. Makes sense. And let's talk about their relationships to other birds. Penguin ancestry beyond Waimanu remains unknown and not well resolved by molecular or morphological analysis. The latter tend to be confounded by the strong adaptive autobomorphies of the spheniciforms, a sometimes perceived fairly close relationship between penguins and grebes is almost certainly an error based on both groups' strong diving adaptations, which are homoplasies. On the other hand, different DNA sequences datasets do not agree in detail with each other. What seems clear is that penguins belong to a clade of neo-aves, living birds except paleognaths and fowl. That comprises what is sometimes called higher water birds, to distinguish them from the more ancient waterfowl. This group contains such birds as storks, rails, and the seabirds, with the possible exception of the caradiforms. Inside this group, penguin relationships are far less clear. Depending on the analysis and dataset, close relationships to cichiforms or to procellariforms has been suggested. Some think the penguin-like plolipteroids, usually considered relatives of anhingas and cormorants, may actually be a sister group of the penguins, and those penguins may have ultimately shared a common ancestor with the pelicaniforms. Interesting. So pelicans and the pelican species or family and the penguin species family may have an ancestor, and consequently would have to be included in that order, or that the plopteroids were not as close to the other pelanicorms as generally assumed, which would necessitate splitting the traditional pelicaniforms in three. In 2014, analysis of whole genomes of 48 representative bird species has concluded that penguins are the sister group of procellariforms, which they have diverged from about 60 million years ago. The distantly related puffins, which live in the North Pacific and North Atlantic, developed similar characteristics to survive in the Arctic and subarctic environments. Like the penguins, puffins have a white chest, black back, and short, stubby wings, providing excellent swimming ability in icy water. But unlike penguins, puffins can fly, as flightless birds would not survive alongside land-based predators such as polar bears and foxes. There are no such predators in the Antarctic. Their similarities indicate that similar environments, although at great distances, can result in similar evolutionary developments, i.e. convergent evolution. Now we talk about anatomy and physiology. Penguins are superbly adapted to aquatic life. Their wings have evolved to become flippers, useless for flight in the air. In the water, however, penguins are astonishingly agile. helps insulate the birds in cold waters. On land, penguins use their tail and wings to maintain balance for the upright stance. As penguins are counter-shaded for camouflage, that is, they have black backs and wings with white fronts, a predator looking up from below, such as an orca or leopard seal, has difficulty distinguishing between a white penguin belly and the reflective water surface. The dark plumage on their backs camouflages them from above. Interesting. Diving penguins reach 6 to 12 kilometers per hour, which is 3.7 to 7.5 miles per hour, though there are reports of velocities of 27 kilometers per hour, which is 17 miles per hour, which are more realistic in the case of startled flight. The small penguins do not usually dive deep. They catch their prey near the surface in dives that normally last 1 or 2 minutes. Larger penguins can dive deep in case of need. Dives of the large emperor penguin have been recorded reaching a depth of 565 meters, which is 1,845 feet, for up to 22 minutes. Penguins either waddle on their feet or slide on their bellies across the snow while using their feet to propel and steer them, a movement called tobogganing, which conserves energy while moving quickly. They also jump with both feet together if they want to move more quickly or cross steep or rocky terrain. Penguins have an average sense of hearing for birds. This is used by parents and chicks to locate one another in crowded colonies. Their eyes are adapted for underwater vision and are their primary means of locating prey and avoiding predators. In air, it has been suggested that they are nearsighted, although research has not supported this hypothesis. Penguins have a thick layer of insulating feathers that keep them warm in water. Heat loss in water is much greater than in air. The emperor penguin has a maximum feather density of about 9 feathers per square meter, which is actually much lower than other birds that live in Antarctic environments. However, they've been identified as having at least 4 different types of feathers. In addition to the traditional feather, the emperor has after feathers, plumules and phyloplumes. The after feathers are downy plumes that attach directly to the main feathers and were once believed to account for the bird's ability to conserve heat when underwater. The plumules are small down feathers that are directly attached to the skin and are much more dense in penguins than other birds. Lastly, phyloplumes are small, less than 1 centimeter long, and naked shafts that end in a splay of fibers. Phyloplumes were believed to give flying birds a sense of where their plumage was, or whether or not it needed preening, so their presence in penguins may seem inconsistent, but penguins also preen extensively. That sense would be called proprioception, which is one of the, I forget how many senses humans have. It's not the 5 or 6, whatever people say. Proprioception is one, which is where you can tell where your body is in 3D space, and it basically works via, I think it's mainly to do with nerves that are mostly in your joints, which give feedback to your brain about their direction of bend, which allows you to know where you are in 3D space with, out being able to see. Sorry about the random ramble, but that was something that I found really interesting when studying occupational therapy. The emperor penguin has the largest body mass of all penguins, which further reduces relative surface area and heat loss. They also are able to control blood flow to their extremities, reducing the amount of blood that gets cold, but still keeping the extremities from freezing. In the extreme cold water of the Antarctic winter, the females are at sea fishing for food, leaving the males to brave the weather by themselves. They also huddle together to keep warm and rotate positions to make sure that each penguin gets a turn in the center of the heat pack. I think This system allows penguins to efficiently use their body heat and explains why such small animals can survive in the extreme cold. They can drink salt water because their supraorbital gland filters excess salt from the bloodstream. The salt is excreted in a concentrated fluid from the nasal passages. The great auk of the northern hemisphere, now extinct, was superficially similar to penguins, and the word penguin was originally used for that bird. Centuries ago, there are only distant relatives to the penguins, but are an example of convergent evolution. Now we move to Isabelline penguins. Perhaps 1 in 50,000 penguins of most species are born with brown rather than black plumage. These are called Isabelline penguins. Isabelline is different from albinism. Isabelline penguins tend to live shorter lives than normal penguins, as they are not well camouflaged against the deep and often passed over as mates. Now we look at distribution and habitat. Although almost all penguin species are native to the southern hemisphere, they are not found only in cold climates such as Antarctica. In fact, only a few species of penguins actually live so far south. Several species live in the temperate zone. One of the Galapagos penguin lives as far north as the Galapagos Islands. But this is only made possible by the cold, rich waters of the Antarctic Humboldt Current that flows around these islands. Although the climate of the Arctic and Antarctic regions is similar, there are no penguins found in the Arctic. Several authors have suggested the penguins are a good example of Bergmann's rule, where larger-bodied populations live at higher latitudes than smaller-bodied populations. There is some disagreement about this, and several other authors have noted that there are fossil penguin species that contradict this hypothesis, and that ocean currents and upwells are likely to have a greater effect on species diversity than latitude alone. Major populations are found in Angola, Antarctica, Argentina, Australia, Chile, Namibia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Satellite images and photos released in 2008 show the population of 2 million in France's remote Île-aux-Cochons has collapsed, with barely 200,000 remaining, according to a study published in Antarctic Science. We move to penguin behaviour. Breeding. Penguins, for the most part, breed in large colonies, the exceptions being the yellow-eyed and furland species. These colonies may range in size from as few as 100 pairs for gentoo penguins to several 100,000 in the case of king macaroni and chinstrap penguins. Living in colonies results in a high level of social interaction between birds, which has led to a large repertoire of visual as well as vocal displays in all penguin species. Agonistic displays are those intended to confront or drive off, or alternatively appease and avoid conflict with other individuals. Penguins form monogamous pairs for breeding season, though the rate the same pair recouples varies drastically. Penguins lay 2 eggs in a clutch, although the 2 largest species, the emperor and Peking penguins, lay only 1. With the exception of the emperor penguin, where the male does it all, the penguins share the incubation duties. These incubation shifts can last days and even weeks as one member of the pair feeds at sea. Penguins generally lay 1 brood. The exception is the little penguin, which can raise 2 or 3 broods in a season. Penguin eggs are smaller than any other bird species when compared proportionately to the weight of the parent bird at 52 grams, which is 2 ounces. The little penguin egg is 4.7% of its mother's weight, and the 450-gram 1-pound emperor penguin population and to minimize the risk of breakage in an adverse nesting environment. The yolk, too, is large and comprises 22 to 31% of the egg. Some yolk often remains when a chick is born, and thought to help sustain the chick if the parents are delayed in returning with food. When emperor penguins' mothers lose a chick, they sometimes attempt to steal another mother's chick, usually unsuccessfully, as other females in the vicinity assist the defending mother in keeping her chick. In some species, such as king and emperor penguins, the chicks assemble in large groups called creches. Now we move finally to penguins and humans. Starting off, penguins have no special fear of humans and will often approach groups of people. This is probably because penguins have no land predators in Antarctica or the nearby offshore islands. Dogs preyed upon penguins while they were allowed in Antarctica during the age of early human exploration as sled dogs, but dogs have long since been banned from Antarctica. Instead, adult penguins are at risk at sea from predators such as sharks, orcas, and leopard seals. Typically, penguins do not approach closer than around 9 feet, which is 3 meters, at which point they appear to become nervous. In June 2011, an emperor penguin came ashore on New Zealand's Peka Peka Beach, 3,200 kilometers off course on its journey to Antarctica. Nicknamed Happy Feet after the movie of the same name, it was suffering from heat exhaustion and had to undergo a number of operations to remove objects like driftwood and sand from its stomach. Happy Feet was a media sensation with extensive coverage on TV and the web, including a live stream that had thousands of views, and a visit from English actor Stephen Fry. Once he had recovered, Happy Feet was released back into the water south of New Zealand. Now, in popular culture, penguins are widely considered endearing for their usually upright, waddling gait, swimming ability, and, compared to other birds, lack of fear of humans. Their black and white plumage is often likened to a white tie suit. Some artists and writers have penguins based at the North Pole, but there are no wild penguins in the Arctic. The cartoon series Chilly Willy helped perpetuate this myth, as the title penguin would interact with Arctic or subarctic species such as polar bears and walruses. Penguins have been the subject of many books and films such as Happy Feet, Surf's Up, and The Penguins of Madagascar, all CGI films. March of the Penguins, a documentary based on the migration process of the emperor penguin, and a parody titled Farce of the Penguins, Mr. Popper's Penguins, is a children's book written by Richard Florence Atwater, and it was named a Newbery Honour Book in 1939. Penguins have also appeared in a number of cartoons and television dramas, including Pingu, created by Silvio Mazzola in 1986 and covering more than 100 short episodes. At the end of 2009, Entertainment Weekly put it on its end of the decade best of list, saying whether they were walking in March of the Penguins, dancing in Happy Feet, or hanging 10 in Surf's Up, these oddly adorable birds took flight at the box office all decade long. A video game called Pengu was released by Sega in 1982. Set in Antarctica, the player controls a penguin character who must navigate mazes of ice cubes. The player is rewarded with cutscenes of animated penguins marching, dancing, saluting, and playing peekaboo. Several remakes and enhanced editions have followed. Most recently in 2012, penguins are also sometimes depicted in music. Interesting that a game like that got a re-release version in 2012, where it's a little bit more rare to see that type of game popularized. In 1941, DC Comics introduced the avian-themed character of the Penguin as a supervillain adversary of the superhero Batman. In Detective Comics, DC number 58, he became one of the most enduring enemies in Batman's rogue gallery. In the 60s Batman TV series, as played by Burgess Meredith, he was one of the most popular characters, and in Tim Burton's reimagining of the character in 1992 film Batman Returns, he employed an actual army of penguins, mostly African penguins. Several pro, minor, college and high school sport teams in the United States have named themselves after species, including the Pittsburgh Penguins team in the National Hockey League and the Youngstown State Penguins in college athletics. Penguins featured regularly in the cartoons of UK cartoonist Steve Bell in his strip The Guardian newspaper, particularly during the following Falklands War. Opus the Penguin from the cartoons of Berkeley Brethren is also described as hailing from the Falklands. Opus was a comical, existential penguin character in the cartoons Bloom County Outland and Opus. He was also the star in a Christmas show, A Wish for Wings That Work. In the mid-2000s, penguins became one of the most publicized species of animals that form lasting homosexual couples. A children's book, And Tango Makes Three, was written about one such penguin family in the New York Zoo. Interesting. And thank you so much for listening to that episode of Whispering Wikipedia. I hope that you enjoyed. I had a few small technical problems throughout the recording, but I am fairly confident I can get it in post, but in case not, I'm sorry about that. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you to whomever it was that requested, and I hope you enjoyed. If you have something you want me to read about, please leave it in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to read about whatever you want. Again, thank you so much. I found it really interesting to see the wide variance of different penguins. And I always, in my head, for some reason, mixed up the Arctic and Antarctic. And I think I need to start keeping in my head, not saying North and South Pole, but saying Arctic and Antarctic to remember. Anyway, thank you so much.